of securing growth, a lot of discussion has been around the issue of economic growth and how we can safeguard it going forward. And my panelists, very quickly, we have Dr. Kusi Kitui, who is the Secretary General, United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, Madam Claire Kamanzi, all the way from Rwanda, who is the Chief Executive Officer of the Rwanda Development Board. We have Wanjiru Gikonyo, who is the Founding Trustee and National Coordinator of the Institute for Social Accountability. And joining us from Johannesburg, we have Bohani from the ABSA Group, where he heads the working capital as well as trade and sales matters regarding financing, and that will be a part of this conversation. You can be part of this conversation online by tweeting at NTV Kenyatta Mboko JH. We'll be happy to get your feedback on these matters. Kicking off the conversation very quickly with Madam Claire in Rwanda. Not to flog this horse, but Rwanda has been cited as a good case in point of how we can work with data-driven policy action, particularly around a pandemic scenario. How have you done it, and what can we borrow from you going forward when you look at the future of the African economy?
Thank you very much, Julian. I'm very pleased to join you from Kigali and all of you in Kisumu. Very good to see fellow panelists, Dr. Kitui and the rest of the panelists. Good afternoon from Kigali. Well, our experience in managing COVID-19 has been very much around tackling the health issues and challenges that come with COVID-19 pandemic, but trying to do that as quickly as possible and as efficiently as we can in order to be able to resume economic activities as much as possible. First of all, our economy finished 2019 on a very strong point. We grew at 9.4% in 2019, which was among the highest growth rates, not just internally in Rwanda, but also compared to the rest of the continent and also globally. And so when 2019 ended, we knew that 2020 could have been a better year, except the pandemic happened. And so all our efforts as a country and government in 2020 has been, how do we deal with this in a fast way, if we can, in order to resume some economic activity to reduce the impact that would otherwise be very negative on the economy. And so we started by organizing the leadership and governance around managing the health and economics of COVID-19. First of all, we had cabinet meetings every 2 weeks, chaired by His Excellency President Paul Kagame. And every 2 weeks, we were making decisions on what to open, what to close, which economies, which sectors of the economy could open. And we went every 2 weeks updating those decisions because it depended on how the pandemic was showing itself, but also what we were learning and how we're managing the pandemic. And so it was a 2 week cycle of decisions, watching and adjusting accordingly. We also had a task force chaired by the Prime Minister, which was reporting to Cabinet every 2 weeks. And that task force included key ministers of the economy, finance, health, infrastructure, among others, to make sure that everybody was participating and coordinating efforts across the board as much as possible. And that really was helpful for us to manage the pandemic. And then, of course, also we put in place a command post, which was a national one with 2,000 people dealing with the pandemic, but also advising on the economic side of it. And so with that organization and governance around the pandemic, we were also able to mobilize the citizens to buy in, because we needed citizens to do what they were supposed to do, and because of the trust that they have built over time with the government, they were able to comply and to agree, whether it's behavior change or wearing masks, etc. So with those aspects of the pandemic managed, we were able to also bring in the economic side to start. First of all, to mobilize.
Let me respectfully hold you there and cross over to Dr. Kitui just in the interest of time. Dr. Kitui, when this pandemic was at the initial stages, you and I had a conversation as to what it meant for the economy. What's your assessment of the lay of the land? And when you look ahead, what role is trade going to play in shaping the post-COVID African economy?
Well, thank you very much. And
sorry.
May I also first express my appreciation to my friend and teacher, Professor Nyang' Nyong'o, for inviting me. And thank you to the leaders of Kenya and Rwanda for being supporters of this initiative, both last year and this year. And very much said to the Nation Media Group, this conversation is necessary. And I just hope that we can build on this foundation to go even deeper on how can we craft ideas of going forward. The state of play is as follows. Globally, there has been a very dramatic drop in all major indicators of global engagement. 49% collapse in foreign direct investment. And it's just across the board, cutting all areas from greenfield projects to mergers and acquisitions to cross-border financing, project financing, a net 49% decline. You know, the most affected areas of international trade or economy is the services industry, with 80% collapse in air travel, 75% collapse in tourism, and the related subsectors of the service industry. Some of the jobs in small and medium enterprises are wiped off the table, not to come back. So we're looking at a challenge of compounding existing unemployment and pressures for jobs with pre-existing conditions in many of our economies now coming to turn around. But there's an even worse picture for Africa in terms of international trade. Globally, we are tracking 2020 to be averaging between 7 and 10% decline in global trade. But for Africa, the decline is much larger for reasons that are very, very clear, and I'll just mention some of them. That the decline in Africa's export market between 17 and 25%, and its import, not between 25 and 35%, and imports between 17 and 25%, depending on regions, is a very, very dramatic change. Now, two things are very clear. One, countries which trade mostly with their neighbors have had more resilience in dealing with the vagaries of changed maritime rules, difficulties of seamen to get on shore and change at ports, and so on. But Africa, 15% of Africa's trade is with Africa. Compare that with Asia at 55%, the Americas at 55%, Asia at 60%, Europe at 69%, which means that those who are most disrupted in their economic daily lives by the disruptions caused by the pandemic in international maritime trade are Africans more than any other. Secondly, Africa has been extremely dependent on international trade. 95% of our pharmaceutical use is imported from outside Africa. 85% of the food we eat is imported from outside Africa. So when there is major disruptions of international supply, international trade networks, we are much more vulnerable than the more established continents and countries. And lastly, in this area is a phenomenon that over the past 5 years, the rise in economic nationalism in major developed economies of Europe and America, the technological possibilities of overcoming the challenge of labor, cost of labor in production, have been seeing most production being reshored. Companies that were producing in Asia, in Africa, domesticating or going regional in their networks. That means that the enterprises out of Africa, which have been having a niche in international supply networks, are now ruptured by the shortening of global supply networks. So this is the state of this, the lay of the land. Before we start saying now, how can we deal with this? Just one little thing that I wanted to say, which relates to some things that were being said earlier. When we talk about post-COVID recovery, we don't just talk about like we get to the end of one station when the COVID has stopped and we start the movement of now recovered. Recovery is embedded in the crisis. That the economic recovery, reorienting our production, diversifying our regime of activities, and the priorities politicians give to levers of reducing the pain of the COVID has to be embarked on even as we learn how to mitigate the health pandemic.
I see. And let me cross over to Bohani in Joburg. Bohani, the issue of embedding the recovery within the economic strategy has emerged from Dr. Kitui here. The banking sector has been at the center of this. When you talk about reprofiling credit, especially in light of the shock that many businesses have suffered, what do you see as the way forward? Because clearly the question of pricing of risk and asset quality is really standing forward for the resilience of the banking sector, Bohani.
Thank you very much. And Asante from the city of Johannesburg in the south of the continent. It's beautiful to be here. Thank you very much for inviting me. I think, it's probably worth taking a step back. If I was to talk about the current economic conditions and how banking has viewed the current environment, it becomes quite a difficult story. But I think let's delve a little bit into what we are seeing and take a sectoral view, because I think it becomes a much more, clearer story. Because what we are seeing is that there are different kinds of behaviors depending on what sector you're talking about. So first of all, if you look at agriculture, if you look at health, if you look at telecoms, that is actually a growth story during the pandemic itself, right? So even from a banking perspective, what you've seen more capital and more support going into those industries. Of course, when you look at certain industries as tourism, in the hospitality, I think, as my fellow panelists has also just mentioned, in aviation and also in infrastructure, we've seen obviously some serious depression in that space, some serious challenges, and therefore capital would not have been going into those sectors. So I think, so when you're trying to understand the impact of COVID today, and probably trying to understand the post-COVID environment from a banking perspective, is you're looking at probably an emergence of new growth sectors, which seem to be agriculture, which is quite resilient, the health sector, which is quite resilient, and I think pharmaceuticals, which are quite resilient. But interestingly, it's also important to make a point that I think he was making, which is what the global disruptions of the global supply chains have actually meant in terms of the continent. It's also meant that it's created an opportunity for the localization of supply chains, creating an opportunity from an African perspective for us to create or even grow our manufacturing capacity. And let me take some time here to say, so when you're talking about how banks are viewing, banking assets, or how banks are viewing what is happening in the African economy, you're looking at growth sectors, you're looking at sectors that have had some serious challenges, but you're also looking at something that is starting to emerge, where you're seeing countries trying to take ownership, and we're seeing this across retailers, pharmaceuticals, where you're starting to see efforts to localize supply chains within the continent. Now, let me link that, by the way, to the free trade, the Continental Free Trade Agreement, to say part of what the objective of the free trade agreement is actually the increase of the intra-Africa trade, and I think my fellow panelists has referred to this. And how do we aim to do that? By creation of regional value chains. So it's not such a terrible story. It's a challenging story for certain sectors. Okay. But I think if I was sitting as an entrepreneur, I have to think, what are some of the sectors that we look, from a bank perspective, as we see going forward, that we are seeing a lot of growth in. As we speak today, as I've indicated, telecoms, health, agriculture, quite useful. Interestingly, though, as I close my comments, it's that we also think, and I think my fellow panelist has mentioned this, that inherent in the crisis itself, it's probably where the recovery is going to come from. Because the question now, the issue is, as governments, seek to stimulate growth, you probably are looking at a lot of infrastructure development, and maybe we need to start directing that infrastructure development to the kind of sectors that will become key to the achievement and the implementation of the free trade area. Thank you very much.
Bohani, let me hold you there and cross over to Wanjiru Gikonyo here. Wanjiru, one of the issues which has been brought to visibility by COVID-19 is the fact that we have fragmentation, or decoupling as it is normally called, between policy and the needs, particularly at the grassroots. When you look at the situation with the Kenyan experience, what do you see as the way forward as to how we can better interface policy and the response to the needs at the grassroots?
Thank you so much. And I think the challenge of the implementation of policy is one that's age-old in Kenya, and I can't pretend to have a solution to that, other than to recognize we have very good policy that is then not implemented. That's a political question, and the issue of political will, political leadership is very important. And one example, of course, is looking at health. The countries that have responded well and fared well, were most proactive in responding to the crisis, have very strong community health structures. Now, Kenya did its pilot on community health systems starting in 2007, and I think had recommendations by maybe 2009, 2010, but this wasn't implemented. We then have devolution. the devolution of health services. But this has not then trickled down into the strengthening of the level 1, the tier 1, tier 2, tier 3 health facilities. So it's very heartening right now that in 2020, the ministry has adopted community health systems policy. But the challenge we have is that at the national level, we are seeing what we call infrastructure fundamentalism. And in fact, I'm very concerned with Bogani's last statement in saying that let's spend on infrastructure that will create growth. Because what we are seeing, the sectors that have been resilient in this country, that have been contributing to the GDP, in large term has been agriculture, which is a decentralized function. The amount being put into agriculture has gone down in comparative terms under, over the last 10 years. But despite that, we then see agriculture continuing to rally and continuing to contribute to GDP. And then this being one of the sectors that has continued to be resilient despite COVID. So I think I was with Mogani when he said we need to invest in health systems, we need to invest in agriculture, we need to invest in the sectors that employ, that contribute to the GDP. And we have had, the part of the problem we're having in Kenya is the lack of fiscal space driven by debt. And this is because of this infrastructure paradigm where we borrowed heavily, put money into unproductive investments that are large. So even the choice of infrastructure matters. Do you want to go for large mega projects, or do you want to go modular? Projects that can be implemented closer to the county level, employ a lot of people, bring in Jua Kali technology instead of importing technology. So I would say that our COVID response has to learn from the mistakes that have been made. And we need to go back to what we call the basics of the human rights-based approach. You need to bring development back to the people, strengthen community systems. And the reality is, as Kenya, we have the policies. But then we have a political leadership that needs to deliver physical big projects. There's corruption involved, of course. World Bank in 2014 published a report talking about they called it inefficiency, lack of productivity of our investments, but really it's budgeted corruption. So we have policy. We need a political decision that we will implement the policy that then employs the maximum number of people, that then puts money into people's pockets, that then employs people who are in the informal sector, equips them accordingly, as opposed to importing solutions and infrastructure that puts us in debt without returns. So that's a very long-winded answer to your question, but it's really to say we have the policies. We need the political leadership. Thank you.
Let me cross over to Dr. Kitui, and the issue which has been brought forth by Jiru is the issue of fiscal space. And one of the realities of COVID is that it has precipitated a situation where we are having a significant debt overhang. If you look at economies like Zambia, for example, in this situation, the story of Africa beyond COVID has to have a robust conversation about how we manage our debt. What are your thoughts, Dr.
The situation is dire and it's getting worse. As you know, let's just take the example of Kenya. Already before the arrival of the COVID crisis, Kenya's public debt was equivalent to 63% of GDP. This year, before the COVID came in, debt service was taking 40% of public revenue. That's not a sustainable model. That's not a situation that can prepare you to confront certain specific challenges coming with the COVID. One, declining most important sectors of the country, like the services industry, the hospitality industry. Two, declining and higher cost of freighting of traditional exports from the country. Three, drying up foreign direct investment. These pile up into a crisis. And I think the challenge you have at the Kusi is, what are the ideas of dealing with an emerging crisis? Usually the first thing is to appreciate, acknowledge that you have a crisis. I was sharing with Professor Nyong'o the story of Nero, the most infamous emperor of Rome, who came about one generation after the death of Jesus. And when Rome was burning in 64 AD, when people complained, when his mother, Agrippina, complained, Nero got people to kill his mother. And he saw 75% of Rome burnt down. For him, it was the opportunity to build an expansive golden house, the Domus Aurea, with 125 acres of gardens, physical, impressive creatures. The reality is, do these impressive creatures talk to the challenges of the moment? How does the shrinking public fiscal space relate to growing unemployment and underemployment, compounded by the disappearing services and SME sectors? Specific actions are necessary. Africa must learn that there is no opportunity to grow through trade without trading with Africa. Africa's exports to the rest of Africa are 42% value added. Africa's export to the rest of the world are 15% value added. So it's no brainer. We create more jobs, we add more value when we trade with neighbors, with Africa, than we trade with the rest of the world. Two, politicians as custodians of regional integration initiatives should not start owning the integration that they can turn on and turn off. We hear very hostile and necessary pettiness in the dialogue across borders, which is taking us backwards instead of preparing to learn from our past mistakes to prepare for the continental free trade area. Three, Africa's main exports, processed food, processed base metals, can actually fairly quickly be produced in Africa, given our resource profile. So paying more attention in building productive capacity, looking more and more seriously at regional and domestic markets and capabilities, and looking at investing only in such infrastructure that is directly related to dealing with the short-term crisis of unemployment, underemployment, declining livelihoods, should be the political priority of thinkers and implementers on the continent going forward.
Thank you, Dr. Ari, for that point. And let me just latch onto that as a crossover to Buhani. Dr. Ari here has spoken about the need for addressing the issues of unemployment, underemployment. We know that in Kenya and in many African countries, micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises are the engine of employment. From a banking perspective, the agenda going forward should be about de-risking these enterprises to avail them for capital. How do you address this?
So it's a very good question. And I think multiple studies do indicate that, for example, specifically in trade finance, the ICC, AFDB would talk about the fact that you've got a financing gap of about plus $90 billion. If you look at it holistically across all sectors, it's probably far much more than that. So I think banks do know that this is an issue. Now, one of the things that I think we need to be very good at, it's making sure that we, the working together between commercial banks and development financial institutions, it's something that gets more accelerated, because the best way, at least the working way that we know to be able to, to allow financial institutions to offer more financing to the SMEs, which, by the way, as you're saying, are very critical. And I think studies do show that economies grow the most, through SMEs, and they are responsible for most of the employment. So, from a banking perspective, it's a question of how do we ensure that development financial institutions, or DFIs, are actually working even better with commercial banks. And I think for me, there's a few things that we have to do. One is being specific about the specific sectors, or the sectors that are quite key in the SMEs and are actually linked to Africa's growth agenda, and making sure that we understand those sectors even much more better. And then in addition to that, looking at multiple ways. I think as we speak today, we know that most of the support that comes from the DFIs, or development financial institutions, is actually through guarantees. But I think we need more agile ways. We need better structures to ensure that we can meet the demand of the SMEs, which are largely around credit and financing. So credit and the actual financing itself, and the actual funding itself. And I think out there, we need to find even more better ways. And I think the third thing for me would be we need to be able to use the current digital revolution and the kind of data that exists within the telecom sector and many other players in the economy to be able to assist banks, to be able to make better, faster decisions around SMEs. I think one of the things that as a banker I know, and many bankers would know this, I think there's very little understanding of the risk profile of the SMEs. I'll give a very practical example. It's where you have an SME that is supplying to a big multinational in the country. So whether it's Safaricom, whichever name it is, obviously there is actually an easier way for banks to be able to take risk on those big multinationals and provide financing to the SMEs, providing room for them to continue to supply and grow. So I think what is important, I think three key things for me. One is the use of data that exists today in a lot of digital platforms for banks to be able to make better and faster decisions. That's quite important. Two, the utilization of or a better partnerships between commercial banks and DFIs, because this thing will not be achieved purely by commercial banks. And I think thirdly, most importantly as well, for me, it's linking the growth sectors as identified by various countries, as well as the free trade agreement with the kind of financing that we can put in place to be able to enable the growth in those sectors. So I think it's a critical component. I think from many financial institutions, our banks as well, APSA included, there's a lot of work that is happening around accelerating financing of the SMEs, because the SMEs are going to be the driver and the engine of this growth that we're talking about.
All right. And my director tells me I have about 5 minutes to go, so let me just quickly cross over to 10 and really briefly discuss the issue of accountability. We're discussing the issue of interfacing policy with needs. Now, the question of accountability has really emerged, especially with the expenditure we've incurred in light of COVID-19. How do we strengthen this going forward? Because a lot of questions are still hanging out there as to how we have allocated and used the funds which have mobilized in light of the pandemic.
Thanks very much. Now, again, it comes back to the issue of political accountability, because we have a very robust public finance management framework that requires transparency. One of the loopholes is with regard to debt. Before the expenditure happens, in terms of contracting debt, there's a lot of opacity. And we've got a very strong treasury and a very pliable parliament that has failed to play oversight in terms of the procurement of debt. And then this debt is not ring-fenced. So you have money going into general support sometimes, or you have it going into projects. And government is not able to report and trace this money. So there's a failure to comply with public finance management. And when we look at it, we say that there's probably a mistake in terms of giving public officers immunity in their professional conduct, and that the clauses for immunity need to be removed so that public officers can be held accountable and liable for making procuring debt at expensive rates for projects that then don't follow due procedure, as we know has happened with SGR, with dams and all of that, so that those particular officers can then be held accountable and not run circles around the courts as happens. The other side of this, of course, is transparency. Access to information has continued to be a challenge. We are seeing efforts from Treasury. We are seeing more information published. But obviously, it's coming a little bit after the fact. The last thing is stakeholder engagement. We've seen a reluctance to engage, especially with governance type of civil society, people who are critical in terms of the question. So when government is afraid to deal with civil society that will be critical, or at the local level, fearful of opening up, because some counties equally are fearful, then, of course, the environment for corruption takes root. So we have an open governance framework. Counties and national government have signed up. Yes. But again, the gap is in implementation. And in the counties where we've seen governors who are proactive embracing open contracting principles, then you don't have the problem.
Okay.
So it's basic. It's going back to basics, transparency, accountability, participation. And if I can say on the last thing, in terms of debt, the debt overhang, we as we are part of a coalition, and we feel very strongly that the government of Kenya needs to go for tax relief, needs to negotiate a moratorium, especially with the Chinese and with the commercial lenders, because we don't have fiscal space. Okay. We are seeing higher education institutions now being forced to consider putting up fees of public universities on par with private universities. Yes. So we are seeing really, we're seeing also health services not being funded because government is very cash constrained. Yes. So we are in a crisis, and I think I completely agree with what can I call you, the minister has said, that we need to name it, and then we need to take remedies, and part of that is we need a moratorium to give Kenya the fiscal headspace to respond to the...
Let me just hold you at that and cross over to Dr. Kitui. And I should say, I don't hold brief for the Treasury, but there's an economic recovery strategy which is proposing debt rescheduling as well as cancellation where possible. Let me cross over to Dr. Kitui. And the question here is, one challenge that we have is that we have a vastly informal economy. And anytime you speak to the micro, small, and medium-sized businesses in the informal side, they will tell you, why would I formalize when it means more taxes, yet I don't see the return for investment, if I could call it that? How do we formalize this vastly informal economy, Dr. Kitui, and ensure that indeed there's a trickle down, as economists love to call it, of the dividends?
All right, I'll answer that bit together with just some concrete suggestions on my fire escape in the crisis that we're entering. Traditionally, informal sector is treated as a domicile, as a social domicile of people. It is not treated as an engine of economic growth. So that many policies that we have dealing with the informal sector are often control policies, not facilitation policies. If you check, a lot of people are called informal sector. They keep 9 employees, and when they expand, they open another parallel enterprise with 9 employees, because they know that if you get 10 employees, the cost of tax compliance, health certificate compliance, city authority compliance, environmental standard compliance are higher than the benefit of that added employee. So what is first and foremost necessary is government attitude towards the informal sector should be how to strengthen their sector as a production engine. How do we create infrastructure for them to access cleaner, cheaper water, for them to access markets as suppliers to other enterprises, for them to supply consumers of their services like workers in construction sites. So that attitude shift from harassing, controlling, extorting to facilitating is a game changer. Secondly, this rights to the whole small enterprise sector. In countries like Kenya, which have gone through devolution, there are not enough people who are talking about this. But a trader has become casualty to the proliferation of taxing authorities. You produce something in the Kondele, before you reach somewhere, agents of Professor Nyang' Nyong'o are looking for their share. When you cross into Kericho, somebody's putting there, some fellows with a chain across the road with yellow overalls, they're asking for a certain levy. You cross and you continue paying these taxes, and yet you are supposed to be competitive. You should ask yourself, why is Kenya importing cheap products it used to export? When you increase the taxation on the producers, when your competition is standing still on the cost, you turn yourselves into consumers of other people's produce. There is no recovery that is possible in any country without addressing questions of competitiveness and rationalization of the proliferating taxes that the different entities are taxing the producers. Some just specific suggestions about a way out. Number one, we just published our Economic Development in Africa Report 2020, which shows that on average, Africa is suffering $90 billion of illicit financial flows out of the continent. That means 50% of our shortfall on SDG financing can be covered if we stop the theft of our legitimate money. It doesn't make much sense to be looking for how can we get more money when we don't address how can we stem the flow of what we already have. Number two, one of the main engines of growth emerging for younger persons is the digital economy, the opportunities of electronic marketplace visibility, and digitalized services to service other even production networks. Unfortunately, we still have this mentality of financing that you come, you have a great idea, you have a laptop, and you are asked, can we look at your credit history? Can we look at assets you can use to secure a loan?
Yes, Dr.
Startups cannot start business this way. What I would suggest is part of recovery strategy should be the government to de-risk credit to small startups, particularly in the digital economy. And second last, agriculture. I strongly believe a developing African country like Kenya, like Rwanda, like Uganda, must find ways of smartly subsidizing agriculture. You cannot just leave it to the vagaries of the open marketplace. You are not New Zealand. And that is difficult when you are increasingly devolving agricultural functions. Last. To the President of Kenya, thank you very much for very innovative ideas that he had in introducing some tax waivers, 5% reduction of personal income tax, and so on. I would like to suggest humbly that you do not suspend those waivers when we're still in the middle of the pandemic. Continue with those waivers until the alternative mechanisms that you have announced are in place. Then you can remove this. Thank you.
Dr. Kitui, allow me to respectfully hold you there. Sadly, we are out of time for this conversation. Clearly, we needed more time, but that takes us to the close of our conversation on what the shape of a post-COVID African economy looks like. We shall be continuing with more of the program. There's another session coming up with my colleague, Joseph Warungu. Thank you.
This is NTV.